you wait a year and a half for it, it's like, oh, it's okay.
Well, weather is good.
It was super good. Learned a lot of new things. Karen will let me know what,
Almost.
okay,
But we got some on Canada.
go.
I'm guessing that's our movie.
I'll go ahead and call the meeting. Karen, can we please have a roll call?
Commissioner Chappelle,
Here.
Jordan Carpenter,
Here.
Becky J,
Here,
Evan Source,
Here,
and Sally Cohen is absent, as well as Commissioner Oliveros and
Mr. Praskas.
Commissioner Parasimus. They have all indicated in advance that they would not be unable to attend and therefore are excused.
All right. Buddy, who's here, have a chance to review the minutes of the August 19th, 2024 meeting, and if there are any corrections to be noted or made. Take care of that right now.
that's so long ago.
I had no corrections. Did you have any?
I don't have any. I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So we,
All those in favor?
Did I have, was there a second?
I seconded it.
Thank you.
Minutes are approved. Obviously, we won't have any visitor or public comments tonight because we have no visitors. So we'll just move on down to the new business. It's the downtown parking management plan. And I'm sure Fred will be happy to give us a staff report.
Yeah, that's right. So the last time we had a meeting, you folks did get a chance to take a look at this. This is back with some changes, before you folks. Most of the changes are pretty minor, all in all. But this is the downtown parking strategy. You don't need to have a public hearing about it. It is something that the council will adopt by resolution, but what I'm looking for from you folks is just any sort of final changes that you would like before it goes to council. And then sort of, yeah, your concurrence that it's ready to go. I think we went through it fairly in kind of detail last time. But just to remind folks, some of the guiding principles that it mentions, downtown's growth should build on the characteristics that have made downtown a great place. And that land in downtown is valuable, scarce, and should be managed wisely. I'm on page 9 of the plan, which is page 15 of your packet. Also, recognizing that parking is just one component of the overall sort of transportation system, and like some of the things that, you know, I think I've learned from this project is, yeah, you can provide parking, but if the parking is not convenient, people will not necessarily use that parking. And so we've got parking in places like the movie theater parking lot, which a lot of times is very, very empty. It's about a block away from the main portion of downtown. The level of connectivity to get there is perhaps not strong enough, and so so that's something that we could improve. But that, I mean, that just really impresses upon me that, yeah, you know, you can provide parking, but parking in and of itself is not going to like be used. It needs to be convenient. Parking, it needs to make sense. It's part of a larger system. Yeah.
it also needs to be known.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. And so some of the things that you can note, there's basically 5 buckets of strategies. One is parking management. So and just things related to that. So some basic strategies. I'm on page 31 of the packet now. Just some basic strategies related to that. Collect annual parking data, see how we're doing as part of with parking. The study itself says that there's something like 600 some private spaces and 600 some public spaces. So how many of those are getting used on a daily basis? Knowing that as one of the actions that it recommends, Also just simple things like know who owns what and sign it appropriately. What are the parking allowances in these various places? So that's another one of the just basic actions. And then, you know, as sort of in the longer term, like try and figure out if we do look at things like occupancy and we're consistently full in certain areas, consider establishing paid parking or parking management to a certain degree. That is on page 35 of the packet, and you'll note that it's one of the actions for long-term consideration. Second strategy of the whole thing is just exactly what Becky was talking about. Parking information and wayfinding, trying to make it clear where you can park, how long you can park there. And in a variety of ways, so having that on things like signs definitely, but also our website. So there is that. The strategy 3 is code reform. We did have a consultant as part of this, really take a look at our code and identified some concerns with the code as it's written. Some of those are, well, I think there's a number of concerns. It's just complicated to provide parking on a lot, especially when you have things like setbacks from neighboring lots associated with it. So like every parking lot is supposed to have a 6-foot buffer adjacent to the street or adjacent to neighboring properties. And so if you've got a small lot, 12 feet is a lot of land. And so just trying to figure out how to actually do parking on some of these smaller lots that we have in downtown is really challenging, especially given all those requirements. Also, I mean, one of the things that our code fundamentally wants is it wants a walkable downtown. With that thought, we have a standard that says all building, you're supposed to have 50% of a lot covered with buildings. Well, 50% of a lot covered with buildings really does push the ability to then provide parking on the lot, right? Especially if you're trying to provide one space per residence and trying to make the project pencil. Add to that complexity, things like a 15% requirement for open space in the downtown riverfront zone. And the 6-foot on the sides of the parking, not to mention 200 square feet of vegetation per every 10 spaces. All of a sudden you understand how complicated it is to make these things work on a lot, right? And so that was really one thing that became clear through that analysis. They recommended a number of things associated with that strategy. The fourth strategy is just basic safety improvements. That's where you'll see the safety improvement idea that potentially you do back in enabled parking on the C Street. Also like just trying to improve visibility at the corners of particular streets as we're encouraging parking more through the downtown. So I'm thinking that like Second and C, make sure that people don't park directly adjacent to the corners, so you can make sure that you can see pedestrians can see cars,
And
all that sort of stuff. What's it?
put a sign that C is one way going west, don't turn down.
Exactly, that's one thing that our consultants definitely talked to us about. And then just sort of a long-term strategy of transportation management. They didn't get into that too far. They did give us originally just a whole laundry list of suggestions, and I was like, this, we don't need to go through all of these as part of this plan. So anyways, that's basically the plan in general. Are there any thoughts about the plan or any changes that you folks would like to say?
So I got a couple questions and I think I know the answer, but I just want to make sure.
the removal of any parking minimums is to comply with state law, correct?
Right, so the plan says that that's a long-term consideration that we could consider. We don't need to remove parking minimums at this point. That is a state law related to larger cities, but we're not within that requirement. I will say that with that, the housing land use adjustments that we talked about recently, people can essentially remove parking minimums, if they go through that process. But, it's not a recommended code change at this point, like full-blown code change at this point.
And Chair, if I can have a question. Thank you. Second question is, one of the recommendations that I actually really appreciated was being more mindful about loading and handicap spaces, but in the like code change, I didn't see a priority for that, so I trust and believe that that will be a priority for you, but I guess my question is that something we need to make sure is like the actual language is in here before going to council, to make sure that we're actually.
So that is in the plan, it's not in the code per se, because
Right.
the code, so. The code is really in a lot of ways related to how parking is provided on a private site. Not necessarily how the public parking is managed.
Okay.
So I mean, and I think that it makes sense, that would be an operational decision, so working with Kenna and Gerald to implement what that looks like.
I do have one more, but there's other people. Okay, well, thank you. The last question I have is, again, probably because I didn't fully understand that part, but I feel like I need to ask anyway. In the commercial zoning part of the code, we talk about different kinds of public places or public, basically, we talk about lodging, right? So we had the hotel, and I was thinking also, could that also mean apartments, right? And you have here 1 stall per unit plus 2 visitor parking stalls. And so my question is, does that mean for a hotel, for example, let's say we had a hotel in the downtown overlay zone? Does that mean 1 parking spot per hotel room when it says per unit?
So that would specifically relate to lodging uses. And I think so what I did for that was I just pulled the downtown riverfront zone
Okay.
language over to apply it to the entire city. When I was looking at this, I realized that language is in the downtown riverfront zone, but we have it nowhere else in the city. And so it was one of those things where it's like, okay, that probably makes sense. I'm just gonna pull it over. And put it in here, because this general matrix right here applies to every property in town.
Right.
So if somebody put one of these in at central town edge or something like that, that standard would apply. Currently, we do not have that standard in there.
So, but really follow up really quick, sorry.
Go ahead.
Does that mean, would that be one?
One per unit plus 2 general visitor stalls.
And a unit is a hotel.
Hotel,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Chair.
Vicky?
And, excuse me, Greta, can I remind everybody to make sure your green light is on your microphone?
I just have a comment in reading this again. It talks about how our general laws are more suited to suburban areas rather than a walkable downtown. And it goes on to talk about that. But I would remind everyone that this is a bedroom community. It's not there's 2-3 blocks downtown that's walkable. But most people don't live there, and the people who live there, like in the apartments down below, most of them, there are 2 people, there are 2 jobs, they don't work in Independence, they have 2 cars. So when we talk about 1 parking space per unit, that means that public parking or parking in other places is gonna be used by the other car. And I know you're gonna tell me they have a garage, but most people's garages are full. And if they get home first, even if they park in their garage, if they leave first in the morning, the other person has to back out of the driveway and let them out. So I'm kind of confused why they kept kind of pushing off that it's a suburban community, when we are a suburban bedroom community. And people who live here mostly work someplace else. Just a point.
I would say that's partially true, I mean, as part of this plan, we did talk to people who live down there with multiple people in the apartments with only one car. They have made that choice. So, I mean. And I would also say, you know, it's. I agree that we need parking. I think what this study in a lot of ways shows is that we have a lot of parking. What my question would then be is what is the best use of our land downtown? And I would argue, and I gave the example when we first started this project. When they tore down the buildings, I think it was in the 1960s. On the north side, or on the east side of Main Street where the park is. They had a conversation about what should go here. One of the recommendations that they gave was the parking lot. Right, and they drew it out, they drew that, hey, look, we could put 68 some parking spots there. Now, I would argue, what is the best use of that space? Would it have been 68 parking spaces? Or is it the plaza? And I would argue too, that if it's true that the plaza is the better use of that space, then why wouldn't that same idea apply elsewhere? So, that's. I mean, really, this is a conversation about how best we should use our land. So.
I agree, the plaza is very nice, the park is very nice, it's a great venue for doing things there, having all sorts of activities. But if you also wanna have people dwelling downtown. Like the apartments down below on Osprey Lane, or in some of the buildings. We have to realize it's not all single people, it's not all retired people who can get by on one car. It will also include couples who aren't buying a house yet, but who both have jobs and both take them out of the city at different times. And I just want to make sure that we understand it's a bedroom community. And it's nice to have that walkable area downtown. It's very pretty. It's certainly much better than Independence was in the 60s and 70s. And I think that's great. But if you want to bring in urban dwellers to downtown, we have to realize they are also going to need transportation. And the trolley doesn't get them to Salem or Albany or Corvallis or wherever it is they're having to go for their job. And they will need a vehicle of some kind. So we need to keep that in mind, that yes, it's nice to have that, and no, I wouldn't want a big parking lot on Main Street. But if we're gonna encourage multi-use buildings with retail on the floor and apartments above, people will need a place to park their car.
I understand.
Can we talk a little bit more about the long-term strategies? And how are we gonna communicate with the community about? Some of the stuff in here talks about fees, talks about enforcement, talks about things that, you know, I feel like I've heard from the community that they would have concerns about. So I don't want us to be moving something forward to the council in a way that it sounds like we don't have like it's gonna go to the council anyway. But I guess my concern would be confusing people into thinking that's part of the plan as of now. And I wanna make sure that we talk it out about like there are no fees as part of this plan,
Right,
and if long-term fees are decided, there's gonna be a long community conversation about that. So I guess my question to you, Fred, is like, how do you envision that happening?
yeah, so what the plan essentially recommends is inventory, like actually look how the parking's performing. And monitor it. And so if we see areas that are consistently at 85% occupancy, which is like consistently, then what it recommends is then start considering, okay, how do we manage this situation? Before that, it recommends a whole number of things, like have conversations with the business owners. Make sure businesses aren't parking in prime parking spots for extended periods of time, which we know is happening on certain streets. So it really does talk about that, and then also how I envision it happening is that 85% is not gonna be seen all throughout the city, and so if we do consistently hit 85%, and I'm gonna say on C Street. Then it's gonna be one of those things where we monitor, we talk with folks who are parking on C Street, and say, hey, how I would envision it. Again, long term, this is not something that is directly coming out of this, in fact, I would say that this plan shows that we have a number of strategies that we can use to avoid getting to that. But then it's a conversation about, okay, we're consistently seeing 100% occupancy on C Street. We're gonna do a little pilot parking management area and test it out, try it out. That's how our consultant, as part of this project, is recommended. Like, if you do parking management, you could do it on a limited basis to try and turn over some of these primo spots that we know are out there, so.
And one more follow-up. really quick. And does that limited parking management mean maybe they turn it to 2-hour spots or 3-hour spots or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, and it definitely recommends doing stuff like that first as well. One thing I haven't, one thing I've been meaning to do, and it's just slipped my radar, but with things like enforcement, there's a cost of enforcement, right? That's always been one reason why, in a lot of ways, when I hear a conversation about enforcement, my mind immediately jumps to, okay, there's some sort of fee there to help enforce that. So, it's possible that we could figure out a way to have two-hour parking and have it managed well. But at this point, with our general fund, the way that it is, I just don't know how that works. I understand that, some small cities manage 2-hour parking. I haven't made a couple of calls to figure out how they do that, you know, how do you manage parking? So that's one thing still to do, because I do think, yeah, we could go to 2-hour parking. But it's like one of those things where if you do it, if you say you're gonna do it, then no one's ever out there. And people are just gonna park there like they normally do, so.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Should we proceed on down to the parking code revision then?
What do you think? I mean, is this generally where you folks wanted this plan to be? I do think that, they have. I mean, they did a good job of looking at our system and giving us a number of strategies to move forward. I also do think that their recommendations are generally good. It's like essentially you have capacity places, point people to the capacity that you have, right? That's a great recommendation. Also, not just point people to it, but make it comfortable, make it fun to park at the riverfront and walk up into downtown. How might that look, you know? I think all of those are good strategies. Also, yeah, just making it clear, like, oh yeah, you can't park at this lot, all of that sort of stuff.
I think this is something the city needs. Give it a definite focus.
Yeah,
The other,
I mean, I like 90%. I'm a little concerned about the back end parking. I'm a little concerned about some strategies that feel big city focused and don't really fit the character of our community. But I think like 95% of it's great, and I just wanna make sure, once this is adopted and even before that, when council sees it, that we're talking about how it's kind of like the hodgepodge of strategies, and these are all options that we can try, and just because something is listed in here, doesn't mean we're gonna do it.
yeah,
Because I don't want people to latch on to one or two things that maybe we all think, you know,
Yeah.
that might not work here, you know, but it's in the plan, so. I just wanted to kind of say that for the record.
yeah, and I'm more than happy to frame it more that way when I present it, because I mean, frankly, I get the value of back and angle parking, right? That too is one of those things where it's just kind of feels like, it feels weird talking about it on C Street, and it's funny to me because I'm convinced part of the reason that the C Street spots are so prized is because you don't have to parallel park there.
Exactly.
And so adding a barrier, having it back in parking removes the primeness of those spots in my mind. And so I just think that it doesn't make a whole ton of sense.
so you're thinking that people will avoid parking on C Street?
Well, maybe that's how to open the spots.
Well,
Instead of
I
doing
park
any sort
on
of
C
parking minute.
I'll be there tomorrow, I'll get my haircut, and actually, the last time I had my haircut, it did come up with the people at C Street Salon. And they told me that won't work, there were older clients.
No, it's
They listed probably 10 or 15 names of people that they cut their hair, their women's hair. If they won't be able to back, my wife told me she would back it. But 99% of the time, if I have a 9 o'clock haircut, I have to park someplace else anyway, because C Street is all full. So is that back in parking? It's gonna happen for sure, is that something that?
No, none of the recommendations in here are gonna happen
Just-
for, this is a guideline for how to. See, coming out of the transportation system plan, coming out of the 2040 vision plan. Both those documents said, we need to consider parking in downtown. So what we did was we went out, we solicited, it was actually technical assistance that we solicited from the TGM program. Thankfully, because the issue was more complicated, they funded the consultant to help us work through this. So that's sort of how it worked, and I do think, that, the recommendations are true, like, they're not coming in here and proposing anything super drastic, because they still think that we have some room to maneuver, right? So,
Who's the company, or C Street is like the next door, the next 2 doors down, have the big black panel vans, Manuel. That, if you have to park next to them, and I have a RAV4 with not in my pickup, and you're trying to back out of a head-in parking spot.
oh yeah,
That is a pain.
Yeah.
So I mean, myself, I know I could back into a back spot,
Yeah,
but
I have to worry about if you're backing into a spot, what about the traffic that's coming? You know, it's hard enough sometimes to get traffic to let you parallel park. But trying to back up on the street and traffic is coming, I think that will create a lot of issues.
and a lot of,
yeah, it's funny, I mean, you see, it's a, there's a lot of back and angle parking, that's going in. In cities, I mean, last time I was in Omaha, I saw back and angle parking in Omaha, which felt really, I mean, Omaha's a bigger city, but I was like, wow, I never expected to see that here. So I mean, it's a transportation engineer solution.
I'm trying to remember where my wife and I were at, since this last meeting, went back in parking on C Street, and I think it was someplace in Eugene. There was back in parking. I thought, well, we just talked about that, and there, the walk, city block, somewhere downtown Eugene, everybody hit back. I mean, I know,
It's a thing, definitely.
really, definitely, like the big parking lots, I see more people back in, so they can get to their starts. A lot of the whole bastards, so,
Right.
like Becky said. If you're backing out, I mean, I've never had a near miss backing out, because usually people are courteous enough, if they see something, if I see somebody backing out. I'd be gonna wait, because I'm gonna take their spot. If I don't have to take a spot, I'll just be courteous and let the driver come out. I'd be kind of interested to know how many bicycles have been hit, because that was the thing I read here, that, right, this safety issue of bicycle riders. And, you know, here lately, I've had more near misses with bicycle riders. You know, running stop signs and just, you know, freewheeling down the street, especially these electric bikes. Those things go, you know, on
They're
my,
fun.
well, the cars are bad. There's 3 guys that ride electric bikes down Randall Way and towards C Street or, I mean, towards, you know, shopping area there. And they don't even stop at the 11th Street stop sign. And, or, well, you know, I'm thinking one of these days there's gonna be a.
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, I ride F and Randall Way pretty regularly, and. I mean, you don't expect that one of those streets, and it must be 11th, is free through movement, right? From the south and north,
Right?
You know.
It's not a four-way stop.
that's not a 4-way stop, I think a lot of people look at that and think that's a 4-way stop.
Kind of venturing, excuse me, Becky, I remember venturing off on this. When we, my wife and I do our walk, the new subdivision, we come through 11th. Will 11th ever hook up in the new area?
Towards south,
Yeah,
um,
and it would require another bridge over Ash Street.
we won't build another bridge. Down 11th, but yeah, I imagine that 11th would connect into. Whatever develops on that property to the south.
Okay.
So, but it is, I mean, it won't funnel that whole east side of the river north. Cause. All of that stuff is gonna come out Chestnut by 13th. Right, so
Someday.
someday,
Well, just today I was driving around out there and it's like there's 434, 435. It's like, man, we can be in a bridge on 11th Street. And I can get Chestnut and I can go to Monmouth the back road.
yeah.
Probably save time. Okay.
I had a really crazy idea one time, but I think people here would kill me if I mentioned it.
Roby, if I can, one more thing.
Go ahead.
So, I look forward to talking about long-term, strategies with this group. I think there's some really cool ideas. I hope we learn how to use the parking lot of the park and make sure that people feel safe using it. I think that's a real solution. And I think there's a lot of really cool ways to make it look attractive, and welcoming. And just trying to be strategic of how do we work with these businesses to make sure that the really key, easy parking spots are really reserved for customers of these businesses. And then the last point is, making sure that whatever, that people who have physical limitations really do get priority in these spots that are close, as well as loading. I do see people fairly frequently right on C Street, kind of loading and unloading pets. I think like, I always feel bad because like if that one spot or those one or two spots are taken, folks have to like kind of drag their dog into the vet. Everyone's experienced trying to drag, negotiate your dog into the vet in the first place. Doing it all the way down the street is a little challenging, so I really wanna make sure we put on the record that, at least for me, I'll only speak for myself, those two strategically placed, like, reservations, I guess, for spots, I think are really important, especially as our community ages. We just wanna make sure that the downtown's accessible as possible.
And I mean, so those short-term stays, I mean, they even had the idea that those could be used by like, the to-go pickups, as well. That makes tons of sense to me. Again, my question then becomes, and it's a bigger conversation. When you do that, if you do that, how are you gonna make sure that those stay open, right? If people aren't out there making sure that those are turning over, then it's, I mean, it's like the 30-minute spot on C Street. Some people just go there, they park, right? So how do we make sure, so that it is part of a larger conversation. And definitely there's a few different strands or avenues that we'll have to go down. Moving forward with this, so.
Thank you.
You could give us all little stupid darts, suction cup darts, and if a car is staying someplace too long, we can all put darts on it.
Publishing, I parked.
Gallagher did a whole thing on that years ago, it was really pretty funny, and then the police would just go around and find the car with all the darts on it and write a ticket.
That's funny. The whole public shaming, one time I parked too long in a spot, or maybe in a spot I wasn't supposed to, up in Coopville, Washington, and they came back out to my car. And someone had written a tome and put it on the front windshield. Telling me I couldn't park there, or maybe I was too long or whatever, it's like, okay, I'm not gonna park there anymore.
So, I paid for my own private spot in a private lot. And every once in a while, even though it very definitely has a sign that it's for, such and such, somebody will park in there because parking can be so hard to find. So I have a little thing, some little sticky notes that says, you're in my spot, Sheldon. Yeah, sometimes you just gotta take it with, what it is and.
Yeah.
So your staff memo says that planning commission may make some recommendations or may,
Yeah,
and so would that require a motion?
yeah, if you would make a motion, that would be great, just to make sure that I can tell the city council that you folks have looked at it. That from your perspective, it's good to go, that would be excellent.
Voila, Karen puts one right up on the street.
Are you guys fine with moving it forward as is, or do you feel that staff needs to modify those plans before we send it forward? As it seems like it's iffy for the group at the moment, so I'm just wondering what consensus is there.
I think that if we could go ahead and move it forward, but we need to let the council know that we see the recommendations, but we're not in favor of imposing any of them at this point, that we need to explore options for signage and connectivity before we do any of those things to make use of what's already available. And that we read this report to say we have plenty of parking available, we just need to access it better.
So is there a way for us to motion that? Or it's kind of where my question is, because it sounds like then that he needs to go back and rewrite it, so that includes those things before we move forward. Chair, is that my understanding?
If I can, I actually think we can move it as is, and I think Fred has actually heard us loud and clear and can kind of give the perspective of the planning commission around making it clear that these are a hodgepodge of ideas, and that it's really up to the council to kind of rank that priority of how we're gonna try. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I think it seems fair. I wouldn't characterize it as a hodgepodge. I do see a whole bunch of them as related, like, I mean.
Fair.
But it's one of those things where it's like, I mean. And they are in sort of a logical order, like,
Yes.
talk to the private property owners to see how, if you can use their lot. If you can't use their lot, then figure out signage and stuff like that. It's like, so they sort of do build, so, but yeah, no, I mean, point well taken, I mean, and definitely. Not all of these are gonna be implemented, and probably what's gonna happen is we go down some road and we come up with an idea that's. Perhaps a little different than this, and we go in that direction as well, so.
So there's some. Latitude here, you know, we have to follow it rock solid.
This is not a regulatory document, this is a guidance document, like. For how to address parking in downtown.
What's to take a stab?
So,
I could probably just motion it, yes, ready.
Okay.
no, I was just kind of typing right now, and I wasn't really sure that this is the flavor of what you want, but. That the motion is to recommend council approval of the plan, with staff communicating to council that they recognize that all recommendations may be adopted.
Our suggestions and
That not all, recognize that recommendations are suggestions.
our suggestions and. Will be pursued with, or may be pursued with additional public process associated with actions.
Anything you want to add in your term? You said you're gonna watch it.
I like that should be, I got all one planned out in my head.
Hey, Karen, got all that, Karen, you should write that down.
George.
Okay,
Okay.
that recommendations are suggestions and may be pursued
With community.
with community input.
So does anybody have to state that, or do we just have a second?
So I'll restate that, and then somebody can say that that's what the motion they want to use.
Okay,
Move to recommend council approval of the plan, with staff communicating to council that they recognize that the recommendations are suggestions and may be pursued with community input.
I motion what Karen said.
And I'll second that.
okay, all those in favor? Opposed? Motion passes. Wow, that's a crazy one.
We got there.
Yeah, we did what we needed to do. Okay, we'll now move to 7.2 proposed downtown parking code revisions, file LA-2024-05. Staff report, please.
You betcha, so this would be, so code reform is wanted to. So you know, the DLCD, our grant manager was gonna be here tonight and he had prepared a PowerPoint, do you have that, Karen?
Yes,
Let's just look at his PowerPoint real quick. He showed me what he was planning on presenting, and I think just to remind ourselves why parking management is important. Let's just go through that real quick. It would have been better, far better if he had been here, but he had worked on this slideshow, so I don't think it hurts to look at it.
one of these days I'm gonna get this all figured out.
Zoom in on me.
Share screen one.
So parking regulations and reform, obviously I'm not part of DLCD. So I don't know exactly what Ryan was gonna say with this, but let's just look at it real quick. So go to the first slide there, Karen. Why do we care about parking? All right, go for the next slide. It takes up valuable space, and so one of the things that Ryan was noting in this slide is downtown, in downtowns or in commercial areas, parking takes up a lot of land area, right? And I mean, even look at this, looking at this after reviewing his slide earlier today, I looked at the hotel. The hotel is, I wrote down all of this stuff, is the building footprint is 13,000 square feet, right? That sits on a 92,000 square foot lot, that's about 14% of the site. It's just hard to imagine that, isn't it? Also, like, if you look at the movie theater, is about 30% of the larger area. The parking lot takes up about 62% of that site. So it's, when you think about it that way, you can see how it spreads, parking spreads things out. It takes up land, right? I mean, there's a number of things. 2 parking spots is about 640 square feet without any sort of landscaping. Most people live in what, 1,200 square feet or 1,500 square feet. It's parking takes up a lot of land, and so that's part of the reason to discuss this. When you look at a number of cities, it's a huge portion of land use in the city, and you can just see it on the map there. And it's interesting when you look at that map too, like the downtown itself, all the buildings are relatively close together, right? That's why we value the downtown. It's nice and walkable. Buildings are close, businesses are close. As development has happened though, you see those buildings spread farther and farther out, or I mean, at least you can see it on that map. So it does take up valuable space. All right, go to the next slide. It also creates dead spots and streetscapes. So I mean, as we think about this, like, I mean, you know, imagine something like beyond the movie theater parking lot. If something did happen beyond the movie theater parking lot, it'd be nice, because then the movie theater parking lot would be right in the center of the whole, hopefully a whole bunch of activity. But as it is right now, it wouldn't necessarily be clear that when you're in downtown, you can get to something beyond the movie theater parking lot. Do you folks wander cities, or is that just me?
Wander cities?
Yeah.
Well, did a lot of wandering the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things when you're wandering a city is you always get to a certain point and you're like, I don't know if there's anything farther down that way. Right, a lot of times it's a parking, or it might be a blank wall or something like that, and you're just like you might not see anything past it. And you might turn around, right? That's what a lot of times parking does to cities. It creates dead spots and streetscapes. All right, go to the next slide, Karen. Let's see what he's got next. It also is costly to build and maintain. So commercial garages are about 42,000 a space, and Eugene apparently 62,000 a space for Corvallis. And a surface parking space is about $11,000, and that was according to in Corvallis. Now, I'll just say, when we started this project, I actually calculated what a parking spot would cost on a lot that had recently sold in downtown, and I got $11,000. It was exactly the same amount. You know, parking, providing parking is expensive in and of itself. All right, next one, Karen. Also, what gets built doesn't always get used, so that's the riverfront parking lot. So there's a parking lot and it doesn't necessarily get used. Also at the movie theater, a lot of that parking sits empty a lot of the time. So, next slide. He's got some data here about unused parking and multi-unit developments. He says, apparently there's data from Albany, Hillsborough, King County that show the amount unused in multi-unit developments. And I'll just say, in certain developments around here, you go and you look at them and there is unused parking. Some get very full, but others, there's unused parking. Next slide, Karen. What happens when mandates are reduced or eliminated? Rents decrease, more housing gets built, off-street parking still gets built. So I mean, that's one of the things is with parking, with a lot of this parking management or repeal of parking mandates that you see, people are still building off-street parking. It's just a matter of how much you build, and people, as they're financing a project, they will consider it. They'll be like, I won't be able to rent these units if I don't have the space per unit or whatever it may be. So off-street parking is still getting built. Next slide, Karen. I don't know what this was about. All right, next slide.
Do you want me to read his notes?
Wait, what are its notes?
Wilsonville, 114 units. 4K square foot retail, 53 off-street spaces, said they would have built fewer units if they had to meet the city's previous parking standards, and that the units probably would be more expensive. As it is, they said the market rate building will have a few units that are affordable at 80% AMI. There's quite a bit about it. Oh, maybe this is for the next slide, sorry.
But Wilsonville, does Wilsonville get serviced by mass transit?
So,
There is a little bit of mass transit up there. Yeah, they have a transit system. Can you go to the next slide? So other cities have done parking mandate, repeal parking mandates as well. As part of this project, we heard about Pendleton, who removed a lot of their parking minimums in downtown and actually saw upper story development in downtown that couldn't occur. We know that Hood River, I've talked to the guy from Hood River, different city obviously, but Hood River does not have any problem. They've gone completely parking management in downtown, where they're not requiring any spaces anymore, and by doing that, they have seen actual redevelopment of properties that have been unable to redevelop because of parking standards. And then the top one right there is Madras. Madras recently repealed all parking minimums in their downtown. All right, go to the next slide, let's see. So anyways, what he was gonna say is there's just a whole bunch of different ways to do this parking reform. And so what you'll see before you, then I'll transition to the code. What you see before you is sort of a mix of, trying, maybe it's right sizing, I don't know which one it is exactly. But what you'll see is the standards that are proposed, include like making the landscaping standards less restrictive, for parking lots. It doesn't necessarily tweak the overall spaces required, though there are a couple of ways to lower based on counting, how they're counted essentially. I'm sorry. There's a whole bunch of code changes here, I guess we can go through them just real quick, so when you go through page 51, when you look at that. What you'll see is, this is in the commercial development section, this is talking about essentially putting all the landscaping standards in one place. Moving on to page 52, that one place I should say is section 54. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So. With the parking and access standards, what you'll note is. What I'm trying to do in this code is essentially like. Put 54 in one place and 70 of the. Essentially, the buffering standards in one place and then the parking standards in one place, rather than repeating them over and over and over again in the various zones. So that's what, when it points to 73, that's going to the parking standards. When it points to 54, that's going to the buffering standards. So that is all sort of addressed, that addresses all of that sort of stuff there. In 34, there's a number of changes. 34 is our downtown overlay zone. I included a map. In attachment B that shows, or excuse me, it's not the downtown overlay, the downtown riverfront zone. The downtown riverfront zone, basically every property in it has the potential to develop in multiple zones. That remains. It could potentially develop in the mixed use pedestrian friendly commercial zone. And it could develop in the downtown riverfront zone. If it develops in two zones, what I would hate to have happen is have two different sets of parking standards that apply to those lots. The downtown riverfront zone, for instance, that's where the 15% parking 15% landscaping requirement exists. So if you're doing a mixed use building, you have to cover 50% of a lot plus 15% of site landscaping. And then you have to do parking on the other 35%. That is very, very complicated, right? If that zone is right next to the mixed use pedestrian friendly commercial zone or downtown zone. Then all of a sudden, they have the potential of developing in both, right? So they would have one set of standards on the front, mixed use pedestrian friendly commercial zone. And the downtown riverfront in the back, and I just think. That, that doesn't make any sense. So I'll just point to a couple of the lots that I'm thinking about, these three right over here, where the blue house was recently torn down. Those are lots in the mixed use pedestrian friendly zone, the downtown overlay zone of that. And then right behind them is a city owned property, that's the downtown riverfront zone. Our intention is that we're holding on to that property until the front three lots develop. At which time it will probably be one larger project, right, or a couple of larger projects. So that downtown riverfront zone will essentially be part of a downtown overlay zone project. We don't want to have two separate sets of standards there, and there's a couple of lots exactly like that. So that's why I went through the downtown riverfront zone and I tried to make it more consistent with the downtown overlay zone or the mixed use pedestrian friendly commercial zone. So you'll note that there's a whole bunch of things that are just crossed out. And then pointed to, hey, go look at the landscaping standards in 54, go look at the parking standards in 73. Other stuff that you'll note, I think that's still going. I also noticed there's a typo on page 61, slopes roof. That doesn't make sense. So that's that. And then the bulk of the changes then are in 54 and 73. What you'll note is these standards primarily start in 68. And it looks like there's a lot of changes. What I tried to do though is make it clear that this section is talking about multiple things. It is talking about site landscaping at certain times, no, okay. Yeah, no, it's talking about site landscaping at certain times, you'll see that in 2 on page 68. And then it's talking about also, the parking lot landscaping, so. Oh yeah, so the site landscaping you see on 67, you see A there, site landscaping, and then parking lot landscaping, these standards are in there. Right now, but it's just unclear, it sort of jumps back and forth in how it presents it. And so what I was trying to do is make it more clear that these are actually 2 separate things. So you'll see that the parking lot landscaping standards, when you look at that. On page 69, it talks about perimeter landscaping. That's that 6-foot requirement around the outside of a parking lot. And then, it allows the possibility to reduce that 6 feet if you're less than 20 spaces in a lot, but if you do that, you have to provide a buffer between you and your neighbor. Essentially a fence or something like that, you know, to screen your parking lot from your neighbor. I realize there's a whole lot of changes here, they're kind of complex, and I apologize for that. Again, this is trying to right size, so I did summarize all of these changes at the start. Maybe I should have gone through that list at the start. Also, you'll note that on page 70 of your packet, that 200 square feet of interior parking lot landscaping that's required for every 10 spaces. I put that down to 150 feet. Potentially it could even go less than that. It seems to me that we could have even down to 120 feet, just sort of take it, well, I would probably do 140 feet. If you wanted, you could do 7 by 20, and that would be 140 square feet. Basically, the idea is just providing more flexibility to actually achieve some of these standards on a lot. Is what this is trying to do. Also, it says on page 70 there, on the interior landscaping standard, any extra landscaping used along the perimeter of a parking lot or used for parking lot screening can be used to help meet this requirement. So if you have extra in one place, you can actually count it toward that interior landscaping standard. Yes.
As I'm reading this, looking at the picture, it looks like they're trying to make use of the tree planting in the green area for drainage. But when I'm reading it, it really doesn't say that, but is that the point of trying to have some landscaping within the parking lot is to control runoff?
It's not, no, that's sort of a separate thing, so what they're trying to do with this is they're trying to the 6 feet is envisioned to screen the parking lot from people like walking along the side of say you're walking down a street, what it envisions is 6 feet of landscaping essentially to buffer the sidewalk from the cars. And that is all well and good, except for when it's like a narrow lot. So a lot of the lots in downtown are, I mean, 25 feet, maybe. So 25 feet, you're taking 6 feet off the sides, right? Or even in, if you're doing infill on a 66-foot lot, you're taking 12 feet off the sides by that requirement. And then you're only able to provide 5 parking spots because or so, potentially you can get a drive aisle in. It's all math, right? I mean, that's the thing about parking, you're looking for 9 by 20, you're looking for a 9 by 20 space, right? And you're trying to figure out how to potentially get a drive aisle in. Well, a drive aisle is 24 feet. Parking space is 20 feet, 18 feet deep, right? So you need at least 42 feet, right? To get a drive aisle and 90-degree in Or if you can't get 42 feet. Then you're stuck, you're stuck with accessing your parking off an alley. Right, and then the amount of parking that you can provide along the alley is limited to however many spaces you can fit on that width, so whatever width it is divided by 9. Right, the space, the width of the space, right? So if you have 30 feet, let's say you have 40 feet, you're taking 12 off the side, and then you can essentially get 3 parking spots on the remaining 28 feet. Right, so you can see how these standards sorted together just really squeeze what can be done on a lot. Another thing, I mean, it is a challenge, so. The Skeletor building, let's talk about Skeletor. Skeletor looks like it covers a whole lot of the site, right? We have a requirement that you're supposed to have 50% lot coverage. Skeletor does not cover 50% of that lot. Right? It feels like the parking. Should be able, I mean. And it's challenging to get parking on that, so I guess what I would just say is, this 50% standard just squeezes the ability actually to parking. You know? And I would say we don't want to like get rid of the 50% standard, because ultimately that's what's. Keeping buildings closed and walkable, right? So it's all of this is. Sort of tweaking around the edges to make some of this stuff potentially make more sense. Of course, I mean, all of this. Yeah, okay, I'll just keep on going. So, when you look at 73, a lot of what you see in 73 is clarification that there's no parking requirement in downtown except for the residential unit, requirement. What you'll note, after that matrix, is there's a couple of things that are being proposed in here. So one is to remove the loading space standard. So currently, not only do you have to provide parking, you have to provide loading spaces and potentially up to 2 loading spaces for larger buildings. So that again is taking up space. Also, you'll see in 73020 on page 74, that the recommendation is allowing on-street parking to count toward the total of the parking on the site. Now, a good example of this is we had a development recently. To provide the parking spaces on site, they would have to remove off-street parking, or excuse me. To provide the parking off-street on the site, they would have to remove on-street parking. And it just felt like because you need the curb cut, that limits the ability to have parking there. They were proposing to do that at 2 separate locations, and and looking at it, it was like, whoa. That doesn't make a whole ton of sense, does it? Right? We're like removing parking. The ability to have parking on a street to have parking on a lot. So this standard that you'll see at the bottom of 74 would allow folks to count on-street parking toward their required parking total. Now, it would only allow it if the street was 2-way, or if the street had parking on both sides of the street. It would also only allow it for the lineal footage of curb that was directly adjacent to the site, if that makes sense. So essentially if you got 66 feet, you're taking 22 feet times 3, you got 3 spaces there that you can count toward your site. That's that general idea. It also makes it clear that just because you're counting those parking spaces to your total does not mean they're your parking spaces, they're still public space. You'll also note that on page 76, there is a proposed change to clarify what L on that page means. Right now, that L is not clear. We allow currently a reduction of 25% of the parking allowed on or required for a use. If you provide parking facilities for uses, structures, or parcels of land, by the creation and maintenance of a facility dedicated to transit-oriented uses such as carpool parking, park and ride parking, and public transit stations and platforms. And we don't quite get what that means and how somebody might request that 25%. And so what we propose is, hey, if you're in the downtown overlay zone, or you're in the downtown riverfront zone, or you're within a quarter mile of a trolley stop or a 40X stop, you could be exempt from 25% of the parking requirements. It does not mean that you're required to provide 25% parking, it's just that you could do that if you want. So that's essentially, those are some of the big ideas of the plans, or of these standards. One, make the landscaping standards more sensible, especially for downtown lots. Two, allow people to count on-street parking for their parking total. Three, clarify that 25% reduction. Four, make the downtown overlay zone, the downtown riverfront zone more consistent. And I'll just say five, like, make the standards for these different zones more consistent, so everything now would be pointing to 54 or 73. 54 is the landscaping requirements, 73 is the parking requirements. I realize that is super complicated, there's 30 pages of this stuff, and it looks way more complicated because there's so much crossouts, but a lot of it is just taking it out, putting it someplace else, and then crossing it out. So I apologize for the labor that I had to spend explaining that, and you folks had to sit through it, but are there any questions?
Did you have help with this?
Oh, yeah, so this is our consultant for this project looked at our code, recommended code changes. Definitely, there were some things that were just immediately like red flags with how difficult, because they took these standards and tried to apply them to project sites to see if they could do it. Right? Can you actually build a building like this? Can it be feasible? All that sort of stuff. In that process, they identified these are some things that are challenging in the existing code. And so based on that, they came back with a draft set of changes. Some of this stuff related to landscaping, I then went into and just tried to consolidate more, because that's something that we've been doing with our code over time, is put the same thing in one section, so it's not super confusing for me to implement or other people to understand. Also, it makes it easier to edit in the future. If we determine, you know what, that standard's stupid, rather than having us go in the future and change it places. Changing it just once, that makes tons of sense. And so that's why we've been consolidating portions of the code in the past. Sort of taking that same idea, once we had the draft that we had, it was like, okay, let's go in and look at some of these vegetation standards. Some of these, the parking standards and whatnot. parking, minimums and all that sort of stuff, and let's make them consistent. I will say there was one more change that, our consultant did recommend. It was for childcare facilities, they recommended, currently we have, it almost looks like two separate standards. You guys remember when I showed you the Donald Shoot video? Were you guys around for the Donald Shoot video? It was like the first video I showed, it was downtown parking. Or it's parking minimums, the guys don't know, anyway. One of the points that he makes in his book and in that video is so many of these parking requirements seem so scientific based on how they do it, right? So he gives the example of a crematorium, so it's like, 5 spaces per space for a body, whatever, like that. And it like seems so like based on like scientific sort of, it seems so precise that it seems like it's gotta be based on something, but in reality, no one has any idea. You know, and that's sort of what it seems like is going on with our childcare facilities. So our childcare facilities, we have 1 space per 2 employees, a minimum of 2 spaces is required. So, okay, 1 space per 2 employees. Okay, I kind of get that. When you go to preschool, nursery, or kindergarten, 2 spaces per teacher. They're just slightly, I mean, they are different. 2 spaces per teacher and 1 versus 1 space per 2 employees. So potentially one has to have 4 times more parking than the other, right? Which, and they seem very similar, a preschool, nursery, and a childcare facility. We sort of looked at that, we didn't know exactly what to do. One of their recommendations actually coming back was that childcare facilities should be put at 0. Partially because a lot of times you see some of these childcare facilities in residential areas and it's difficult for them to meet. The parking requirement, the parking that's necessary in the residential area. They recommended 0, so you'll see that it says 0 there. I'm happy going with a different number. Just recommending that probably we should make some sort of change there. So basically, that's the package of changes that's before you. In all, I think a lot of them are very positive. I will say that the trump card sort of still exists out there, that, you know what, people can come in and say, you know what, still. Even with these changes, I don't want to provide any parking on my site, or I want to provide half the space on my site. They can go through that housing land use adjustment process still. So what we are not recommending is complete repeal of the parking standards. What we think will ultimately happen is people will know that option is out there, and we will see what are the implications if people pursue that, and it will give us a sense of how we might adapt and change going forward. But these are just a set of changes that make sense given the current code that we have. Yeah.
Any questions for Fred? So is this, we did a motion for this, Fred, or?
No, so I wanted you folks to look at this because our grant is ending in October, and so I just wanted to make sure that we had a public hearing on this, that we were gonna get it to the next stage before the grant expires. So the public hearing on this is actually scheduled for next week, but I didn't want to have a public hearing on it without you folks seeing it and having some understanding of what is proposed. So I apologize for the tight turnaround. I was thinking originally, I think I was the one that said, oh, let's not do the 9th, let's do the 16th instead, and then the 16th didn't work for anybody. Then it was like, okay, we need to get a date so we can do something before the 7th, and so that's why part of why we're here tonight, and looking at this.
So with this new housing thing, developers can come in have the 10 choices or whatever they want to throw out. I still don't understand why somebody would come in and want to argue about parking. If they're gonna build something and argue with parking, I'd like to tell them, okay, you build it and then you live in it. And see if you can make it work,
right?
kind of thing.
Right, so I mean, the parking. A lot of the parking work that's being done right now is recognizing just how difficult it is to. To figure out how to make parking work on sites. Cause it just is, and I mean, it's a rectangular box. That you're putting as many of on a site, so as many of them on a site as you can to get. So right now, our current standard is 1 per downtown residential unit. You wanna try and maximize the number of units that you get out of that house, that building or whatever it is. And so you put as many as you can get on there, and your number of units is capped based on the number of parking spaces that you provide. The problem with that is. It might not make the most sense for anybody. Right? So. You know, it might be easy enough to provide 2 more spaces there, or excuse me, 2 more housing units, or 5 more housing units, like, hey, look, I got this whole. Other half a floor that I could use for housing, but instead of providing housing, I'm capped at the number of spaces that I can provide on a site. Right, and so. What the state is thinking with the housing adjustments is to give people the flexibility to go into a site and say, hey, look, I'm not having to worry about parking first. Right? I can design the building that works for me, then I can provide. As many spaces as I can provide on the remaining site. I mean, it is fundamentally the wrong way to design a city, to think about parking first, and that's what. Parking minimums do to you, right? You're approaching the design of the city with how do I get the amount of parking that I need on this project site, right? That is not how to do it. I would. I think it makes far more sense to think about buildings first and think about the utilization of the building and then think about parking second.
So the new structure over here on the corner, there's gonna be
14,
commercial on the bottom. And
commercial on the bottom,
So with the new housing adjustment thing, the state law passed. Does it go back to them or they?
no, they had already gone forward with their proposal.
So that they're meeting the current parking regulations.
They're meeting the current parking regulations, but again, you know, their number of units in that building has been capped based on.
Parking.
Parking that they could provide you.
All right,
Something that you don't think about, but I mean, it's so true, like, we establish these regulations. And then it influences the design of cities, it literally influences the built environment, isn't that just, it is really interesting.
And yet if you don't have some sort of design in mind, or some sort of building in mind, it could be very willy-nilly.
There's no doubt about it, right? Right, and so, there's no doubt about it. One thing that I will note, just based on that, thinking, there is one additional standard that got put in here, so you'll note on page 76, and speaking of willy-nilly development, it made me think of it. It says if a walkway was articulated in the downtown parking plan, a walkway may be provided in the location to meet this requirement. Because it talks about a continuous pedestrian walkway system shall extend throughout the development site to connect to adjacent sidewalks. Well, great. What I thought made sense and why this got added is we've established in the downtown parking management plan some areas where it makes sense to sort of connect future parking lots to Main Street, and so sort of recognizing, hey, we have this in this plan, if they exist. So if you look on page 36 of your packet, there's just some walkways that are shown. Where it's like, hey, wouldn't it be nice if parking is developed behind these buildings to then connect the parking up to the main street? To start making those connections in the future, and so that's what that standard is sort of depicting there, just to have it, so we can point to it in the future. I'll tell you a story, my first job was at in Langley, Washington. Anybody been up to Langley? It's a nice little town. Langley, Washington has all of these cool little cut throughs in its downtown. It's got essentially one big downtown block. And it then cut it up and people made all these pedestrian connections through like that, and it connects parking to the main street and vice versa. And so that's sort of this idea here, where it's like we can build parking, then connect it up, and it would be would be nice, would work well and pretty soon. So that's what that last standard started. Are there any other questions? How is this looking so far? You got any concerns with it?
It's way above my level of knowledge. That's why I asked if you had help.
Oh, yes, yeah, they definitely, we have had, a number of people look at this and talk about this, and just even sort of looking at standards over time and how they play out on sites that's development is occurring, it's like, oh, that standard is so hard to meet on this lot, whatever it might be. Like the off-street parking, but that one project was coming in and it was like, this is so stupid, why are we making them put off-street parking on the lot when they have the exact numbers? They're literally taking away parking, providing parking. That just, stuff like that doesn't make sense, you know?
Well, with these revisions, it will make your job easier.
I would imagine so, hopefully it will just generally make development easier as well.
So then it's, where's the progression here?
So public hearing at the next meeting, and if everything looks fine, we'll have that to you then.
That's coming out this.
That's my next Monday. If you folks look at it again and you think, you know what, this isn't fully baked, let's talk about this further, you absolutely could do that. But then, hopefully to council in November or December.
So when you kind of go over for Jose and Alex and Sally's benefit a little bit.
You bet.
I have one comment on your landscaping, the plants that you use.
Yeah.
And you keep talking about having evergreen shrubs and ground covers.
That's not my language, that's the existing code language.
No, I realize that, but I just look at that and think, it really depends on which way that lot is facing, what you can put there. You can put like Kinnick or something down, but if it's a south facing lot, it's never gonna look very good, and it's never gonna. It's odd to have things like that codified without thought about where it is. It's like putting a rhododendron on the south side of your house in full sun all day long. It doesn't make sense. That was my only thought reading through all of that. 'Cause
Right.
the rest of it made sense that you wanna put it all together, you wanna make it compact, you wanna make it easy to find. But that piece stuck out at me.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I get what you're saying, yeah, no, I definitely get what you're saying.
Kind of like the trees on 7th Street. That every lot lifting up the sidewalk,
Yeah,
it's a hazard.
yeah,
I haven't fallen down the other thing, but luckily, I don't know if it's the cities come out and painted those where they lifted. orange or yellow or some homeowner.
Yeah, I don't know exactly
It's the whole-
what that is. We have learned from that, I mean. We do require root guards for every tree that's planted now.
So,
But they'll still come up, I mean, you can put those guards around them and make the roots go down, but they will still come up. If you talk to a horticulturalist, they'll tell you that really isn't gonna, you need to have a different kind of tree or something.
so is that up to the homeowner?
It's up to the builder, yeah,
Or like the existing houses on Seventh Street that have been there for years now, there's significant looking at the sidewalk. I mean, that's up to
And
the homeowner, I can suppose about
put that little,
a year ago, 2 years ago, we had that big Japanese maple tree in front of our house and it fall into the winter, it sheds leaves. And I go out there and try to keep it clean. It was after a few days of stormy weather, I was out doing something and this lady walked by and goes, I'll sue you if I fall, where this, your leaves on this tree on it. It's like, okay, so I clean them up, but. Just kind of wondering, not that I intend to go out and fall down on his property.
wow, has somebody actually told you that?
Oh, yeah, we've. There's been a few people in our neighborhood. that- Yeah. Many of the dead back into that tree with my trucks. I asked the dead, you know, and it's. Because somebody came out of the next street, what is it, Tyler's place? They came with some kid going to school, I was first thing in the morning, I said downtown to do something, and. Just keep screaming out of that side street, and I was trying to turn around, and. Thought, well, this kid's gonna hit me, so I backed up, thought I was in the driveway. Not quite in the driveway. That's okay. $500 deductibles. State Farm Insurance.
Hey, Chair, I got a question.
Yeah.
So, Fred, and we don't have to talk about this tonight, but maybe for next week, it'd be nice to know how much these changes, how much parking do you anticipate saving through these changes? Like, what are the measurable goals of like, what's the success, what does success look like if these changes are fully operational and are actually saving us? I think I struggle to. These things make sense to me, but it's like, we're doing a lot of things and how much space are we actually saving through all of these things?
Yeah.
See what I'm asking?
Yeah, so. Yeah, so I think that what I'm hoping for from these changes is just more flexibility on the development of the site. I do think that they will help, but I also think that with the housing land use adjustments, I do think that there's a possibility that especially in downtown, people are gonna try and bypass these things regardless. If you're doing a project, you're providing a limited number of spaces, you're still gonna need to provide the landscaping associated with that. So I guess what I would look for with that is, are these landscaping strips or whatever big enough still, right? Or is the interior parking lot landscaping doing a good job of actually still covering the lot, whatever it may be. Also things like, getting rid of this side. Standard. One of the sides, you can have the option of buffering a side rather than doing the whole 6 feet, so you could put up a fence instead, or you could screen it. I guess a measure of success for that is, are these actually like are these effectively screening a neighbor from this development, right? I would say that a fence is no doubt gonna be better than 6 feet necessarily, 6 feet of landscaping, so. Just stuff like that. I think the ultimate proof in the pudding is gonna be just, what are our occupancy rates? How is parking management holistically downtown? Working, I think that's one key finding from the plan that they had was go out and inventory like every year, or if there's hotspots, look at it regularly, like trying to understand what's going on. I think that will ultimately, tell us the most, like. That will tell us where there's a problem, right? It's kind of like monitoring your heart rate or your blood pressure or whatever, you know, are we consistently at 85%? Are we, or in various places? That's what I think is gonna be more so than anything else, the, what we take away from this. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you. Great. No other questions? Any other discussion or informational items?
I didn't bring a video tonight because I figured we'll watch one next week, I thought we'd have enough to talk about, I thought that even Ryan would be here talking about the presentation, so I thought we'd have enough education.
No video, how about a motion to adjourn?
No move.
Seconded.
All those in favor?
I.
Opposed? It is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you, guys.
Eric, Fred.
As always, thank you, Ms. Karen.
Yeah.
I feel like the community aspect of motion, appreciate you.